It's July 22nd, 2026, and inside the last 24 hours, something shifted in this war that hasn't shifted in over a month of nightly strikes. This isn't another wave of tomahawks hitting radar sites along the coast. This isn't another round of missile batteries getting degraded in Bandar Abbas or Bushehr. What's happening right now is the United States positioning itself for something it has only done once before in the entire history of this conflict: a direct strike on the single hardest target Iran has ever built. And the aircraft involved in that positioning are already in the air. I've been tracking this war night by night since the ceasefire collapsed, and I want to walk you through exactly what's confirmed, what's still speculation, and why the next 48 to 72 hours could be the most consequential stretch of this entire conflict. Not because of another round of strikes on missile sites we've already seen hit a dozen times, but because of one mountain in central Iran that has sat on the target list for years without ever actually being touched. Stick with me, because by the end of this, you're going to understand exactly why this specific target is different from everything that's come before it, and why even the people planning this operation aren't entirely sure the most powerful bomb in the American arsenal can actually finish the job. Before I get into it, drop where you're watching from in the comments. I read every one of them, and on a story moving this fast, it genuinely helps to see how far this is reaching. Let's start with what's actually confirmed, because there's a lot of noise around this story right now, and I want to separate it cleanly from what's verified. On Tuesday, during a meeting with Lebanese President Joseph Aoun in the Oval Office, President Trump was asked directly about Iran's nuclear infrastructure. His answer left almost nothing to interpretation. Any site where they're even thinking about nuclear will be hitting it very, very powerfully, he told reporters. That's not vague escalation rhetoric. That's a president naming an entire category of target and telling Tehran, in front of cameras, that the category is now live. And he didn't stop there. In the same set of remarks, Trump said, "We'll be hitting that area very probably pretty soon, and there's not a thing they can do about it." The area he's talking about has a name that sounds almost deliberately ominous once you understand what it refers to: Pickaxe Mountain, known locally as Ku-e Kolang Gazla, sitting in the Zagros mountain range in Isfahan province, roughly a mile south of the Natanz enrichment complex that's already been struck twice in this broader conflict. This is the site Trump has now named directly, repeatedly, and specifically, in a way he has not done with almost any other target in this entire war. Here's the first data point I want you to sit with. Within hours of that Oval Office statement, multiple U.S. Air Force B-1 Lancer strategic bombers reportedly departed bases in the United Kingdom. The UK's new Prime Minister has also approved the use of UK bases for US strikes on Iran. Separately, aerial refueling aircraft have launched from Romania, a movement consistent with refueling bombers headed toward the Middle East. Now, I want to be precise here, because precision is the entire point of this video. The stated purpose of that specific bomber movement has not been officially confirmed by the Pentagon. What we have is a pattern, aircraft consistent with a long-range strike package, moving in the window immediately following the most direct nuclear site threat Trump has issued in this entire conflict. That is not proof of an imminent strike on Pickaxe Mountain specifically, but it is exactly the kind of signal analysts watch for when trying to read the difference between rhetoric and an operation already being built. The second data point is what's actually sitting under that mountain, and why the United States believes it matters enough to risk one of its rarest weapon systems to reach it. Iran moved thousands of centrifuges into the tunnels under Pickaxe Mountain, and according to intelligence assessments, that transfer happened in the aftermath of the June 2025 and February 2026 bombing campaigns, as Tehran quietly relocated advanced uranium enrichment centrifuges into the tunnel network. This isn't a fringe claim from a single anonymous source. It's being reported consistently across multiple major outlets, all pointing to the same underlying intelligence picture. Iran didn't just build a hardened facility. It appears to have moved the actual production capacity for its nuclear program into the one place American and Israeli bombs have never actually reached. And there's a second, more sensitive layer to this. Israeli officials have told reporters that some of the roughly 60% enriched uranium stockpile that survived the original 2025 strikes on Fordo and Natanz is believed to have been moved toward this same site. Officials speaking after the original 12-day war expressed no concern at the time that this material had survived, saying any Iranian attempt to move it would almost certainly be detected, leaving sufficient time to strike again. That confidence is being tested right now in real time, because if the material genuinely is under Pickaxe Mountain, the calculus around this specific strike changes entirely. This is no longer just about degrading a construction project. It's about the physical location of Iran's most sensitive nuclear material. The third data point, and this is the one that actually explains why this story is different from every other night of strikes we've covered, is Trump naming this specific target out loud, repeatedly, over the course of nearly 2 weeks, rather than quietly building a strike package and executing it without warning. Back on July 13th, in a radio interview, Trump called Pickaxe Mountain a possible target for a nice big fat shot, the first time he had explicitly identified the site by name. He returned to it again days later, telling reporters more bluntly, "We're going to take out Pickaxe Mountain. Tell the Iranians to be ready." And now on Tuesday, he escalated the framing again, tying it to an entire category of nuclear-adjacent sites, rather than one isolated facility. There's also a scarcity problem sitting underneath all of this that almost never gets discussed in the day-to-day coverage, and I think it might actually be the most important technical detail in the entire story. The GBU-57 is not a weapon the United States has in deep supply. Each bomb reportedly costs more than $370 million, and the program was never built for mass production. After the 14 bombs used against Fordo and Natanz in 2025, estimates of the remaining American inventory ranged between 6 and 15 weapons total. The Air Force has since awarded a sole source contract to the only qualified manufacturer of the weapons guidance components, worth more than $100 million, to begin replenishing the stockpile. But deliveries of those new bombs aren't expected to begin until January of 2028. That means whatever inventory exists right now, whatever number sits between 6 and 15 bombs in American hands today, is effectively the entire available supply for the foreseeable future. Every one of those weapons, used against a target like Pickaxe Mountain, especially if a double tap or layered strike approach is required the way it was at Fordo, is a bomb that cannot be replaced for years. That scarcity puts us very specific kind of pressure on how this decision actually gets made, because it isn't simply a question of whether the weapon can physically reach the target. It's a question of how many of an irreplaceable, extraordinarily expensive munition the Pentagon is willing to commit to a single facility when the broader war is still consuming other resources every single night. And this war has not slowed down while this specific target has been debated. As of Tuesday, the U.S. had carried out 10 straight nights of strikes since the collapse of a ceasefire agreement that had briefly held in mid-June. The Secretary of Defense testified before the Senate Appropriations Committee that same day, and by multiple accounts, lawmakers on both sides of the aisle pressed him on how long this campaign is expected to continue and at what cost. Questions that, from what's publicly known, did not get especially clear answers. Nearly 100 American service members have suffered some level of injury since fighting resumed in early July, mostly described as minor, though the full scope of those injuries has reportedly been slow to come out as the campaign has continued. 4 American service members were transferred to Dover Air Force Base in a dignified transfer ceremony this week, following the deaths of 3 service members over the prior weekend in Jordan and northern Iraq. This is not a campaign running on cruise control. It is an active, ongoing, costly war, and the Pickaxe Mountain question is being decided in the middle of it, not in some quiet, strategic pause where planners have the luxury of unlimited time to get it right. Iran, for its part, is not staying quiet about any of this. Iran's Qatam al-Anbiya Central Headquarters, the joint command responsible for coordinating the country's armed forces, issued a direct warning this week that any American strike on Tehran's nuclear or other sensitive sites would lead to what it described as an expansion of the war across the region. Iran's foreign ministry has separately accused the United States of using Pickaxe Mountain as a pretext for continued strikes, and has publicly questioned why the head of the United Nations Nuclear Watchdog Agency hasn't responded more directly to Trump's repeated threats against the site. Trump, meanwhile, has tied future strikes on infrastructure directly to Iranian actions in the Strait of Hormuz, saying the U.S. will destroy an Iranian bridge or power plant every time Tehran strikes commercial ships moving through that waterway. That's a linkage worth noting on its own, because it means the war is now running on at least 2 separate escalation tracks simultaneously, one tied to maritime security in the Strait, and one tied specifically to the nuclear infrastructure question surrounding Pickaxe Mountain, and either one on its own could reshape what happens next. So where does that leave the actual decision the Pentagon and the White House are facing right now? Trump appears to be weighing 2 genuinely different paths forward, and depending on which one he chooses, the entire trajectory of this war shifts in a completely different direction. Regional mediators, including Qatar, Egypt, and Pakistan, have reportedly been urging the administration to pursue a new 10-day ceasefire aimed specifically at reopening the Strait of Hormuz to commercial traffic, an option that would presumably put any strike on Pickaxe Mountain on hold, at least temporarily. The alternative path, which multiple officials say Trump appeared to be leaning toward as of Tuesday, is a significantly larger joint military campaign conducted alongside Israel, aimed at forcing Tehran into what officials are describing internally as capitulation rather than negotiation. Trump's own public comments this week track with that second option far more than the first. They want to desperately meet, and until they're ready to meet in a meaningful way, we have no interest, he said. A statement that leaves very little room for the kind of quiet diplomatic off-ramp that regional mediators are reportedly pushing for. I want to walk through what actually happens tactically if the order does come down to strike a target that might genuinely sit beyond the reach of America's best conventional weapon. Because this isn't a hypothetical planners get to avoid. Someone has to actually make this call, and soon, given how publicly this target has already been named. There are really only a small number of realistic paths here, and I think this is where the story becomes genuinely more interesting than just another headline about a scary bomb. The first option is the layered strike approach, the same one used at Fordo. You drop a second massive ordnance penetrator into essentially the same impact crater the first one just created, letting it drill even further down through the hole already carved out, detonating deeper than the first bomb managed alone. Think of it less like a single hammer blow and more like a series of them, each one landing in exactly the same spot, each one going a little further than the last. The problem with this approach is precision. You need an extremely tight impact radius between each successive bomb, close enough that the second one is essentially falling down the same channel the first one already dug. Iran, for its part, is not staying quiet about any of this. Iran's Khatam al-Anbiya Central Headquarters, the joint command responsible for coordinating the country's armed forces, issued a direct warning this week that any American strike on Tehran's nuclear or other sensitive sites would lead to what it described as an expansion of the war across the region. Iran's foreign ministry has separately accused the United States of using Pickaxe Mountain as a pretext for continued strikes, and has publicly questioned why the head of the United Nations nuclear watchdog agency hasn't responded more directly to Trump's repeated threats against the site. Trump, meanwhile, has tied future strikes on infrastructure directly to Iranian actions in the Strait of Hormuz, saying the U.S. will destroy an Iranian bridge or power plant every time Tehran strikes commercial ships moving through that waterway. That's a linkage worth noting on its own because it means the war is now running on at least two separate escalation tracks simultaneously, one tied to maritime security in the Strait and one tied specifically to the nuclear infrastructure question surrounding Pickaxe Mountain, and either one on its own could reshape what happens next. So, where does that leave the actual decision the Pentagon and the White House are facing right now? Trump appears to be weighing two genuinely different paths forward, and depending on which one he chooses, the entire trajectory of this war shifts in a completely different direction. Regional mediators, including Qatar, Egypt, and Pakistan, have reportedly been urging the administration to pursue a new 10-day ceasefire, aimed specifically at reopening the Strait of Hormuz to commercial traffic, an option that would presumably put any strike on Pickaxe Mountain on hold, at least temporarily. The alternative path, which multiple officials say Trump appeared to be leaning toward as of Tuesday, is a significantly larger joint military campaign conducted alongside Israel, aimed at forcing Tehran into what officials are describing internally as capitulation rather than negotiation. Trump's own public comments this week track with that second option far more than the first. They want to desperately meet, and until they're ready to meet in a meaningful way, we have no interest, he said, a statement that leaves very little room for the kind of quiet, diplomatic off-ramp that regional mediators are reportedly pushing for. I want to walk through what actually happens tactically if the order does come down to strike a target that might genuinely sit beyond the reach of America's best conventional weapon. Because this isn't a hypothetical planners get to avoid. Someone has to actually make this call, and soon, given how publicly this target has already been named. There are really only a small number of realistic paths here, and I think this is where the story becomes genuinely more interesting than just another headline about a scary bomb. The first option is the layered strike approach, the same one used at Fordo. You drop a second massive ordnance penetrator into essentially the same impact crater the first one just created, letting it drill even further down through the hole already carved out, detonating deeper than the first bomb managed alone. Think of it less like a single hammer blow and more like a series of them, each one landing in exactly the same spot, each one going a little further than the last. The problem with this approach is precision. You need an extremely tight impact radius between each successive bomb, close enough that the second one is essentially falling down the same channel the first one already dug. And every additional pass over the target is another window of exposure for a B-2 crew flying one of the most closely watched, most heavily defended missions in the entire war, especially now that Iran's top military command has explicitly warned that a strike on this site would be treated as an expansion of the conflict. The second possibility, and this is the one that's genuinely harder to talk about honestly, is that even a well-executed direct strike only partially damages what's under that mountain rather than destroying it outright. The most recent satellite imagery review of the site shows the pair of western tunnel entrances remain open, which leaves them vulnerable to precision strike weapons or ground operation entering directly through those tunnels. And the same analysis notes that air defenses in the area appear easily overcome, the way they were during Israel's early strikes on Natanz. That open tunnel vulnerability might actually be more operationally significant than the massive ordnance penetrator itself, because it suggests a strike aimed specifically at sealing or destroying those entrances, rather than punching straight down through the mountain's granite cap, could achieve a meaningful disruption without requiring a weapon that might not even be able to reach the depth being reported. If that's the path chosen, Iran would still be left with both the motive and the justification to rebuild deeper and with even more secrecy than before. And that raises a question I don't think gets asked enough in the coverage of this story. What happens politically if a strike doesn't fully succeed? Does that get treated as sufficient disruption on its own, enough for the administration to claim a win and pivot back toward negotiation? Or does a partial success become the argument for eventually building something even larger than the GBU-57? A weapon that doesn't currently exist, specifically to finish a job the current one couldn't quite complete? There's also a quieter possibility worth naming honestly, which is that a partial strike gets publicly framed as a full success, regardless of the actual underground damage, simply because there's no independent inspector access to verify the outcome one way or the other. That is exactly the kind of ambiguity that has already fueled years of ongoing dispute over Fordo's true post-strike condition, a facility that outside analysts are still debating more than a year after it was hit. If Pickaxe Mountain follows that same pattern, we may be looking at a strike whose actual success or failure remains genuinely unresolved for years, regardless of how confidently either side declares victory in the immediate aftermath. I don't have a confident answer for you on which of these paths actually plays out, and I don't think anyone honestly does, yet outside a very small circle of people with access to classified targeting intelligence. But it's worth sitting with, because it's a fundamentally different kind of question than anything the earlier strikes in this war have forced onto the table. Every previous major strike in this conflict has been a question of whether the United States would use force. This one is a question of whether the force available is actually sufficient for the target being named, and what happens politically and militarily if it isn't. Let's talk for a moment about what it actually takes to fly one of these missions in the first place, because I think this piece consistently gets lost in a lot of the coverage. Every massive ordnance penetrator strike historically has required B-2s flying from Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri, meaning round-trip missions, in the range of 30 or more hours in the air with multiple aerial refuelings and an enormous logistics chain of tankers supporting the route the entire way. But this week's reported bomber movement is notably different from that pattern. B-1 Lancers, departing from bases in the United Kingdom, with tankers launching separately from Romania, suggests a strike package potentially being staged from significantly closer to Iranian airspace than the Fordo mission required. The B-1 cannot carry the massive ordnance penetrator. That weapon remains exclusive to the B-2 due to weight and internal carriage requirements. So if B-1s are indeed part of whatever comes next, their role would presumably be delivering other munitions, the same 2,000-pound and 5,000-pound class bunker busters that have already been used repeatedly throughout this war against ammunition depots and hardened storage sites in places like Isfahan, rather than the massive ordnance penetrator itself. That distinction matters, because it tells you something about the actual shape of whatever operation is being assembled. It's entirely possible we are watching preparation for a broader strike package that includes conventional bombers, hitting the perimeter, the security walls, the tunnel entrances, and supporting infrastructure around Pickaxe Mountain, while a separate, far more closely guarded B-2 component, if one exists at all, remains completely invisible in the public reporting until after it has already happened. This is worth remembering when you're trying to read flight tracking data or open source military movements over the next few days. The B-2 fleet is famously small. Only a couple dozen airframes exist in the entire inventory, and missions involving it are typically the most tightly controlled in the entire Air Force, precisely because it's the only platform stealthy enough and large enough to carry the one weapon that might actually matter here. If a genuine strike on the deepest part of Pickaxe Mountain is coming, the most sensitive component of that mission is very likely the piece we will see the least evidence of beforehand, which is exactly the opposite of the B-1 and tanker movements that have already become public knowledge this week. Now, before you take any of this as certain, I want to give you the same caution I try to build into every one of these breakdowns, because on a story like this, it genuinely matters more than usual. A lot of the specific numbers floating around right now, exact burial depths, exact centrifuge counts, exact locations of enriched uranium stockpiles, are estimates built from satellite imagery analysis and intelligence assessments relayed through unnamed officials, not confirmed operational facts. With zero IAEA access to the site, there is no independent ground truth to check any of it against. The broad picture is consistent across everything I've reviewed. The site is deep. It's deeper than Fordo, and it sits at or near the outer limit of what even the best conventional weapon in the American arsenal can reliably guarantee destroying. But the more specific any individual claim gets, an exact number of feet, an exact date for a strike, an exact list of what's stored inside those tunnels, the more skeptical you should be until it's independently corroborated. That's true of almost any story involving hardened classified military targeting, and this one is very much no exception. since nearly every specific figure circulating about this site ultimately traces back to satellite photo interpretation, rather than anyone actually having physical eyes inside the mountain. So where does that leave us right now, at this exact moment? The United States has already proven twice in this broader conflict, first against Fordo and Natanz in 2025, then reportedly against an underground IRGC compound in Tehran this past April, that its most powerful bunker buster works exactly as designed against deeply buried Iranian targets. Pickaxe Mountain represents something different, a target multiple independent experts and apparently officials inside the current administration itself believe may sit beyond what that same weapon can reliably defeat outright. It has now been publicly named as a likely target by the president himself, repeatedly over nearly 2 weeks, at a moment when bomber movements, tanker deployments, and newly approved basing access in the United Kingdom are all converging in the same narrow window. Whether this ends in an actual strike on the deepest part of that mountain, a more limited operation aimed at its tunnel entrances and perimeter infrastructure, a negotiated pause tied to the Strait of Hormuz, or an extended standoff where neither side fully commits, is genuinely one of the more consequential open questions in this entire war right now, and it's one I'll be tracking closely as more information comes out. Because whichever way it breaks is going to say a great deal about how the rest of this conflict actually plays out from here.